Hello and welcome to the Bible for Worship at St. Paul Lutheran Church on this 17th Sunday after Pentecost, when our gospel reading is written in the Gospel according to Matthew chapter 20, verses 1 through 16. Jesus said, "For the kingdom of heaven is like a landowner who went out early in the morning to hire laborers for his vineyard. After agreeing with the laborers for a denarius for the day, he sent them into his vineyard. When he went out about 9 o'clock, he saw others standing idle in the marketplace. And he said to them, 'You also go into the vineyard, and I'll pay you whatever is right.' So they went. When he went out again about noon, and about 3 o'clock, he did the same. And about 5 o'clock he went out and found others standing around, and he said to them, 'Why are you standing here idle all day?' They said to him, 'Because no one has hired us.' He said to them, 'You also go into the vineyard.' When evening came, the owner of the vineyard said to his manager, 'Call the laborers and give them their pay, beginning with the last and then going to the first.' When those hired about 5 o'clock came, each of them received a denarius. Now when the first came, they thought they would receive more, but each of them also received a denarius. When they received it, they grumbled against the landowner, saying, 'These last worked only 1 hour, and you've made them equal to us, who have borne the burden of the day and the scorching heat.' But he replied to one of them, 'Friend, I'm doing you no wrong. Did you not agree with me for a denarius? Take what belongs to you and go. I choose to give to this last the same as I give to you. Am I not allowed to do what I choose with what belongs to me? Or are you envious because I am generous?' So the last will be first, and the first will be last." The Gospel of the Lord. Thanks be to God. This parable that Jesus teaches appears in the fifth and final segment of Matthew's five-part gospel, sandwiched between the birth story in chapters 1 and 2 and the passion story that begins in chapter 26. And what Matthew shows in this segment of the gospel is a variety of people's responses to Jesus and to his preaching. So beginning in chapter 19, there are religious leaders who challenge Jesus. There are children who want to come to Jesus, but the disciples would prohibit them, and Jesus welcomes them. There's the rich young man who hears Jesus command to sell all he has and follow Jesus, and goes away sorrowful, for he had many possessions. And then there is the teaching to the disciples to the effect that the last will be first and the first will be last. And that teaching, immediately before this parable, sets up the story of the vineyard owner and the workers, where the conclusion for Matthew is that the last will be first and the first will be last. Then comes a passion prediction about Jesus going to Jerusalem to be mistreated, arrested, and killed. There's James and John's mother asking for them to be first in the kingdom when Jesus comes into it. And then there are two blind men as Jesus enters Jericho who ask simply to be healed, and Jesus heals them. All of these episodes in chapters 19 and 20, up until the point where Jesus enters Jerusalem, seem to be about the question of place, position, privilege in the kingdom. And as the epigram on this parable says, the last will be first, and the first will be last. God's economy is not like ours. This parable is a familiar story to many, with the owner of the vineyard who hires people early in the morning at the 3rd, 6th, 9th, and 11th hours. Literally, the 11th hour is when the last ones are hired. They work only an hour before they receive exactly the same pay as the workers hired at the beginning of the day have agreed to. And the key to this is in verse 15, when the vineyard owner, clearly representing God, says, "Are you jealous? Do you have an evil eye? Do you look on this poorly because I am generous?" It's a common trope, a common form in the parables for a vineyard owner to represent God. And so we realize that this is not a story about the Galilean economy, the way in which vineyard owners and workers in the vineyard necessarily dealt with each other, or even perhaps should, but rather it's about God's economy and the way that it shapes life in God's community, in those who follow God and who follow Jesus. Part of the key to that is precisely in the place where those hired early in the day mistakenly say to the vineyard owner, "You have made them equal to us." No, the vineyard owner has not made them equal to the early workers by somehow paying them the same. That would mean that a person's value is based on what they earn. No, they are equal to you. And God, in God's economy, God chooses to treat all people equally with God's riches, no matter what human economy might look like. Or are we jealous because God is generous? God's goodness is over all. And when we realize that, our human standards of economy are inadequate to the kingdom of God. Once we know that, we know that we have nothing more to gain after we have God's calling and have been brought into God's kingdom. Oh, to be sure, as much as possible, Matthew would also have us create the kingdom economy to the degree that is possible. Because after all, nothing says that these workers at the 11th hour have been lazy all day. They've been idle. But the parable says they've been idle because no one hired us. The problem, when someone is underengaged, underutilized, when someone's talents lie idle in the community, the problem is not their laziness. The problem is a collective problem for the community, how to draw all people in, recognize their equal value, and use the gifts that God has given them to benefit all. Create the kingdom economy in our lives as much as we can, and trust God's economy for our ultimate hope, promise, and salvation. God bless.